either of those two conflicts, but recent developments in the last hours, even in the Ukraine war, suggest that the moment is coming closer when NATO will indeed be directly involved in that terrible conflict. And of course, NATO states individually provide military support to Israel in their current genocide and conflicts in the Middle East. In the past few years, NATO has indeed gone global. It's extended its military reach far beyond its original scope. In its wake go human rights abuses, coups, military interventions, and many terrible episodes that I'm sure you will be familiar with. And of course, this is a far cry from the way that NATO likes to portray itself. So here this evening, to go deeper into this issue, we have a great panel of speakers. We're going to hear from each of those. And the final speaker, Ludo de Brabander from Breda in Belgium, will talk just a little bit about our plans as a network towards the next NATO summit, which is taking place in the Netherlands in June 2025. So we'll encapsulate this evening both an in-depth analysis and a discussion of our plans going forward to challenge the terrible beast that is NATO. You'll have an opportunity after the speeches to put Q&A. So please do put your questions in the chat and then we'll take them as we come to them. And we anticipate the meeting will take no longer than 90 minutes if you need to plan other events this evening. So first of all, I'm really delighted to turn to our first speaker, who's Sevim Dagdelen. She's an MP from Germany, and she's well known as a powerful anti-war activist and anti-NATO spokesperson. Thank you very much, and a big welcome to Sevim.
Thank you very much for this event. As you said, it's a very actual the aggression of the NATO. So I'm very happy that we talk. I have to excuse myself. I have a book event tonight about my NATO book, A Reckoning with the Atlantic Alliance, which is a best-selling book in Germany. And for the English audiences, just a hint, that it's available on Amazon UK and Amazon United States. So the English version, maybe someone is interested in reading the book. So NATO claims to be first, maybe just one thing. It's a very historical moment today, I have to say. It's very historical because of the arrest warrant of the International Criminal Court. First time in history to someone like the Prime in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the former Minister of Defense, Gallant, because it's the first time that International Criminal Law has set an arrest warrant to someone which is almost on a NATO side, or not a member of the NATO, but very close to the NATO and is supported by the NATO. We will see how the NATO's member states will act in regarding if they are going to arrest Netanyahu and Gallant or not. I'm ready to arrest them. I hope everybody of you will too. So NATO claims to be a community, as we know, of values and defense, neither of which holds any water in view of the history and present of the organization and its member states. And if we take a look at the history of NATO and its member states, we have to conclude that fascist dictatorships, wars in violation of international law, and support for the most serious human rights violations lie at the heart of NATO's essence, as we can see now in Gaza. First, the fascist dictatorship. It's often forgotten that the fascist dictatorship of Salazar's regime in Portugal was an accepted part of NATO. Portugal waged bloody colonial wars in Africa with NATO's help and locked Africans up in concentration camps such as the one in Tarrafal in Cabo Verde in order to murder them. Or take Turkey as an example. On September the 12th of 1980, a military junta led by General Kenan Evren seized power, openly supported by the NATO partner countries. Hundreds of thousands of people were arrested and tortured. This didn't stand in the way of NATO membership for Turkey. The NATO preamble, the Charter of the NATO, states following, I quote, "The parties of the treaty reaffirm their faith in the purposes and principle of the Charter of the United Nations and their desire to live in peace with all the peoples and all governments. They are determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their people, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law." Quote end. The reality was quite different, however. The United States, as the leading power in the NATO, reached a bilateral military agreement with Franco's dictatorship in Spain in 1953 that was intended to bring Spain closer to NATO, all the while the Spanish fascists continued to torture thousands of Republicans in prisons and camps. And many attempts have been made to brush this bloody history of NATO under the carpet. So hardly any books about the NATO coup and NATO's intervention in 1974 are available to purchase these days. The best book on this subject in German, it's called The NATO's Crosshairs, Investigations with Cyprus as an Example, by Niels Katrize, is no longer available, even secondhand. So this forgotten history of NATO clearly points to serious shortcomings at the universities of NATO member states, as in a totalitarian system, not one single critic of NATO has managed to obtain a professorship at a university in NATO member states. And if you look at our school books, you'll only find anti-enlightenment propaganda promoting the self-image of an organization whose myths are increasingly fading. In 1784, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant defined the Enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. But NATO, as we can see, wants to escape this enlightenment and criticism with its mythical armor. Second, wars in violation of international law. The state practice of NATO members seems like a cynical farce in view of the voluntary commitment expressed in the NATO Charter to adhere to its goals and principles. The Brown University, very well known, Brown University in the United States has found out that US wars have claimed 4.5 million lives over the past 20 years. 4.5 million lives. And the list of wars and interventions in violation of international law is long, from Iraq to Afghanistan. And this also applies to NATO wars such as against Yugoslavia in 1999 and against Libya in 2011. But I don't just want to draw attention to the wars and interventions that violate international law, which were each intended to be legitimized with huge lies of war, from the Rajak massacre in Kosovo to Colin Powell's show-like appearance in the UN Security Council. I would like to draw your attention to the proxy wars of NATO and its member states. And we are currently witnessing how the US is supplying Ukraine with ammunition and weapons that are banned under international law. Whether cluster munitions or anti-personnel mines, international humanitarian law doesn't play a role here. And if we assess the situation, NATO as an organization only takes international law into account when it is violated by other states, its actions appear to have nothing to do with commitment to international law. And this applies to the UN Charter as well as to international humanitarian law. Through their actions, NATO and its members have also opened the floodgates to violations of international law by others. And they believe they can act entirely in keeping with the Latin saying, "Quod licet Jovi, non licet bovi." What is permissible for Jupiter is not permissible for an ox, is the translation. So this is increasingly running up against resistance in our emerging multipolar world. If you take a look at the G70 leaders declaration from the summit in Brazil now, you will also see that NATO and its allies are increasingly unable to assert themselves at the conceptual level. My third point is the support for the most serious human rights violations. NATO and its member states are lending their full and unwavering support to the Israeli government still, and elements of which are extreme right-wing in this government. The two leading NATO member states, the United States and Germany, are among the main suppliers of weapons to Israel. In NATO and the European Union, some criticism has been forthcoming from Ireland, Spain, Belgium, and Slovenia. And everyone else supports the approach being taken. And yet they have seen the reports of the humanitarian disaster that is unfolding. In Lebanon, hundreds of thousands of homes have been destroyed by the Israeli army. 1 million people have been displaced and thousands of civilians have been killed in Lebanon. And in Gaza, more than 45,000 people have been killed by the Israeli army. 70% of them are children and women. 95% of all schools have been destroyed, and 9 in every 10 children are suffering from infectious diseases. There is a famine in northern Gaza. In other parts of Gaza, people have less and less food to eat. Responsibility for this lies solely with the Netanyahu government and its supporters in the West. And there's no other way to interpret this than to assume that NATO and its member states are giving these crimes, these really awful crimes against humanitarian law and international law, their full backing. In Germany, it should also be mentioned here that it's the Green Party and its foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, together with the extreme right-wing AfD party and the Christian Democrats with their candidate for chancellorship, Friedrich Merz, who's likely to be the next chancellor, who are the most vehement in justifying Israel's warfare. So we must therefore conclude that NATO is an organization that wages proxy wars. Crimes on massive scale committed by proxies are not an obstacle to support from NATO countries. And this means that NATO's trail of blood leads up to the present day. And the task at hand today is to pierce NATO's mythical armor and call it out. So NATO and its member states are increasingly discrediting themselves in the global south, as we can see, because of their double standards, their hypocrisy. And it's time also at the heart of the North Atlantic Treaty in the West for criticism of the organization to be stepped up, an organization that is exacerbating its own crisis by stretching its forces too thinly in a three-front war against Russia, China, and the Middle East, and which is adopting an increasingly escalatory approach in global politics as an agent of the United States, declining hegemony to the point of, the French intellectual Emmanuel Todd called it lately in his last book, what I can recommend as well, of nihilistically calculating that it wants to run the risk of a world war. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Sevim. That's very interesting. And thank you so much for the book recommendations. I know that we find that very useful, and I'm looking forward to reading yours in translation. So now we'll turn to our second speaker, who will be talking about how NATO member states fuel wars through the arms trade. And personally, from working very closely with our next speaker here in the anti-war campaigns in Britain. I don't think there's anyone who could be better to speak on this than Kirsten Bayes, representing Campaign Against Arms Trade UK. Welcome, Kirsten.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you to everybody for joining us. I'm probably going to be using my time a little bit in two halves. One is to talk about the arms trade itself, give people a kind of a whistle-stop tour of what the arms trade looks like, and specifically what NATO's arms trading looks like, primarily the Americans, of course. And then looking at a couple of consequences of this kind of behavior, especially around conflict and around the allocation of resources. And I'm going to make sure I'm running a stopwatch to make sure I don't get into trouble with Kate, because we wouldn't want that.
Thanks, Kirsten.
Thank you. Thank you. So the first thing to say about the arms industry is it is, as I say, a tale of two halves. You have the domestic arms industry in the different countries, and then you have their exports. In the case of the US, for example, something like half of its spend on weapons comes from its own government. So so something like 500 and it's a $533 billion business, of which roughly half of it comes from the American taxpayer. But the other half of it comes from export purchases, comes from money from so-called foreign governments. Same is true here as well. CAT UK specializes in the UK arms trade, and the UK arms industry is a little bit smaller. But even here, you have something like a $28 billion industry, of which about a third is paid for with arms exports, and that's a really important part of the economics of the industry. A lot of people think that the arms industry is kind of basically supported by its domestic government, and that's true. But without exports, it would struggle to make the numbers. Even though, as we will hear when we talk about some of the misallocation of resources, arms systems tend to be ruinously expensive. Now, NATO itself, taken together, makes up something like 70% of arms exports in the world. The US is responsible for 40% of the world's exports, 41%. The balance tends to be China and Russia, but really the US, France, the UK, Germany and Italy are some of the main global exporters. The question is, what do they export? And the answer is it tends to depend by country. But in the case of America and indeed the UK, and I would also argue France, so the French figures are a little bit harder to analyze. The vast majority of their arms exports are aircraft, military aircraft, and missiles to go with them. So when you hear people talking about arms exports and their effect on things, quite often you'll see tanks and armored vehicles, and we'll see some of that stuff when we think about Ukraine, perhaps, or when we think about Afghanistan. But in the main, arms exports are almost 80% of them, at least from NATO, tend to be around aerospace, both warplanes and missiles. And that's their bread and butter, as it were. Weapons are sold by nation states, so sometimes they come out of their stockpiles, and sometimes they sell weapons secondhand, but mostly they're made by arms companies, commercial entities. You tend to find that you have these kind of big national champions, but if you look on the global scale, if you look at the top 6 arms companies in the world, 5 of them, the top 5, are Americans. So the thing to understand is that the Americans see NATO both as a military alliance, but also as a way to sell a lot of arms exports. So a lot of their main exports go to other NATO countries. But when you look at where the exports go from inside the NATO envelope outside, that we're really talking about the focus on the Middle East, and it tends to be arming countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE as big customers. And of course, the Americans are very keen on their quotes military aid, which tends to be billions of dollars, for example, in the case of Israel, say $3 to $4 billion a year, which are then spent on American arms exports, which, as we've heard, are aircraft and missiles. And that, of course, has played a really big role in some of the stuff that's been going on with the genocide in Gaza. Checking the time. The other thing to bear in mind is that that countries are both regulators of arms exports, but they also like to promote their arms exports, and they also export their own weapons from their stockpiles to themselves. So, as we were hearing, at one level, they're supposed to be making sure that we all obey international law when we ship weapons, and that we make sure that we're not shipping them to people carrying out a genocide. But at the same time, we also discover that the Americans, the British, the French will quite cheerfully export weapons to those people who are carrying out major attacks or killing a bunch of civilians. So that's the arms industry in a very rapid run through. Going to talk about a couple of sort of impacts of that sort of behavior. And first of all, let's talk about conflict. And I'm going to see if I can actually share an image. So let's see if I can share this. I thought I'd share this image from earlier this year. This was the Afghan celebration, the Taliban celebration, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, as they call themselves, celebrating the departure of the NATO forces from Afghanistan. And one thing you may notice is that they have an awful lot of military equipment, some of which would probably look very familiar. And of course, you're looking here at some of the $7 billion worth of the NATO stockpile that was left behind when the Americans and the British pulled out. This was part of the sort of the 18 or so billion, but there was probably a lot more military aid that the Americans sent into Afghanistan over the 20 years of the war. But I think we need to understand that war went on for 20 years, and it led to the death of 176,000 people, a third of them civilians. And it was in the end ended by the sort of unilateral action of the United States. But it's worth pointing out that the original cause of the war, the supposed reason for going into Afghanistan, was to track down Osama bin Laden after 9/11. And it's worth pointing out that he was killed by 30 people in 2 helicopters hopping the border into Pakistan. So, which begs the question: why were so many people? Why was so much fighting done there, and what was involved? And the answer is probably that actually the arms sales were a big factor in that conflict being pursued. And we saw the same thing in Yemen. I'm going to stop sharing. Where you had, in the case of the British, $2.5 billion, in fact, $2.8 billion a year worth of weapons going to the Saudi regime. Americans supplying a similar amount. French supplying a bit, not quite as much, but a pile of stuff later in the war. And again, it led to the deaths of sort of 277,000 people, 8,000 in the bombing, and then the rest from the destruction of healthcare facilities and food and transport. So I think what you're seeing is the impact of these arms sales that continue to be made despite the fact of vast civilian casualties, and despite the legal objections from people objecting to the sales and to NATO's behavior. And we've seen the same thing being repeated in Israel, where the F-35 sales, which have been very controversial here in the UK and very controversial in the US, have led themselves to bombings in Gaza, but also the bombings of Israel's neighbors. We're talking about being used to attack Iran, attacking Yemen again, and we think Lebanon and Syria. So I think for me, the thing to bear in mind is that the arms sales continue despite the fact they're used to kill civilians and commit war crimes. And the structure of NATO is very much designed to make those arms sales, to keep funding the arms industry in NATO, and to keep that supply of weapons to going to both NATO's allies, but also to NATO itself. And I think that is the 8 minutes, Kate. I didn't want to keep talking.
Perfect.
But thank you.
Thanks very much. And I'm sure people have questions and you'll be able to give more detail later. So thank you very much indeed for that. No, it's something I wrestled with initially when I was getting to grips with this subject, the difference between the kind of government production for its own uses, so-called, and then the trade, and then the aid, and so on. So that was very good to have that set out so clearly. So then it's now a pleasure to turn to our third speaker, who is Michael von der Schulenburg. He's a member of the European Parliament coming from Germany, and he's going to talk about NATO's war policy in Ukraine and how it refuses diplomacy. And I would just say that his previous experience with 34 years at the UN, I think, puts him in a very strong position to really inform us and help us understand this situation. Big welcome to you, Michael. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Does it work? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm not quite so sure that I will meet your expectations. Now, the Ukraine war is all about NATO. It's about NATO expansion, and that's why the reactions to it. And it will be also for NATO's future if the war is lost. But strictly speaking, what you asked me to, I mean, the NATO has no own Ukraine policy. It is an iron bracket of the US government to keep Canada and the European states in line with their Ukraine policy and not vice versa. So it doesn't act really as an independent global organization which sort of has its policies and people which are mutually discussed and so on. The things of policy, military equipment, support, logistics, and all the things are continue to be done by individual states, in particular the United States and its allies, and not through NATO. NATO is also not refusing any diplomacy. It is because it is not involved in diplomacy. I mean, it sort of talks on the sidelines, but it's not like in some other conflicts that is not entitled to do any diplomacy and negotiate, for instance, the end of the war. This will be done most likely by an individual called Trump, or the Chinese probably less now, but it's definitely not a NATO activity. However, we have to realize the reason why we have so much refused to talk about use the diplomacy to enter the war was about NATO, because we realized that if we start to negotiate, and that's today even more true than in the past, Ukraine would remain a neutral country, or a part of the Ukraine at least, and it would be a loss to NATO. And I think this fear of NATO being as a threat sort of weakened because it has lost another war, de facto, it is probably why we don't want to negotiate. We still hope that something else will come. Interestingly enough, it's also a driving reason for BRICS countries. We had just the summit of BRICS in Kazan, where we had 22 heads of governments and 33 or 36 delegations, I don't know anymore, representing more than half of the world population, probably more than 40% of the world's production capacity. And they met in Russia, a country NATO countries demanded that we isolate them. A very clear sign that they would not necessarily to support Russia, but that they don't want an expansion of NATO. So while BRICS countries on one side want to have an economic policy which makes them more independent from the United States dollar or the Western system, the other aspect is definitely also a security aspect, saying that what holds them together is that they don't want NATO expansion and increase the influence of Western societies in the world. Interestingly enough, is that Turkey, because Turkey is a NATO country, but Turkey wants to join BRICS as well and is now an associated member. And the reason why Turkey does it is, of course, that they don't want the Black Sea to become an American sea. They don't want them there, and that's their area of influence, and that's why they see BRICS countries sort of in an interesting alternative for them to adhere to. We have interesting enough was also the coordination until the summer of this year, the coordination of Western efforts to support Ukraine or to run the war, really, if you want to, only with Ukrainian soldiers, if you want, is done by the Americans. It's Ramstein. And it's only in the summer that they changed it to the US base in Wiesbaden on what they call now NATO Ukraine Commando. And the reason is, of course, here that this has only happened when the United States started to see that this war cannot be won anymore and started to withdraw from the war. And as it has done in Afghanistan and Iraq, and which I've witnessed even personally, how the United States decides simply that the war can't be won and goes away. I'm, of course, worked many years in these countries, and we should not forget what NATO means for those countries. I mean, if you are an African or you sit in India or you sit in, not to speak about China or Latin America, you see that NATO is a power instrument to impose their policies on the rest of the world from ex-colonial powers, mostly white powers. So I think you have to realize that the Ukraine war will have an impact on reducing the influence, is also about reducing the influence of NATO in the future. And I think that's going to happen. People don't want this influence anymore. And you should not forget that NATO represents only about 10% of the world population, but about 60% of all military expenditures. So I think let me say again, as a thing, it's not about policy. It's not about refusal of diplomacy. That's not a NATO thing in Ukraine. It's all about the future of Ukraine and a military power the United States wants to use to put a bracelet around Europe and Canada to pursue its unilateral word and the control of global policies. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Michael. That's very interesting to get that different angle on it. So now we're going to move on to hear a quite different perspective coming from the United States. Anne Wright is a retired US Army colonel, also a retired US diplomat. So a lot of different experience there from Anne, and she's also a central member, very active in the NATO network. So Anne, big welcome and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Kate. And it's a little loud. You hear a lot of noise here because I'm in the very evil institution in the United States, and there are many of them, but this particular one is in the U.S. Senate. And I'm here as a part of a group that's been lobbying the U.S. Senate to try to stop more weapons sales to Israel. And I'll mention that while we were not successful yesterday in trying to get a joint resolution of disapproval, crazy name for this thing, it's essentially voting to stop weapons sale to Israel. Out of 100 U.S. senators, we finally got 19 on two of the bills, 18 on another and 17 on another, but getting close to 20% of the U.S. Congress to finally acknowledge that there is a genocide going on in Gaza and that the U.S. is fueling it with all of its weapons. And so we only got, 20% of the U.S. Senate. So this is an evil place. The majority of senators do not care that the United States is involved in a genocide, which is just, it's horrific. And I'll mention also that the Biden administration yesterday put the full court press on all these senators that the president of the United States was sending messages calling individual senators to say you'd better vote for more weapons. Even Secretary of State Blinken came to the Congress and had a special classified briefing for senators before the vote. So the U.S. is up to its neck in the genocide of Gaza. And despite our best efforts of millions and millions of Americans, and of course, millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world, the biggest instigator for Israel, the one that allows really Israel to get away with this genocide is the United States. And as we look at the U.S. role in NATO, the U.S. complicity in both the genocide in Gaza and now the horrible attacks that are going on in Lebanon. We look at what Israel, and we know what the U.S. role in NATO is. I mean, it tries to run NATO and pretty well does it. Anything the U.S. wants done is done. And the same in the UN. I mean, yesterday, when this vote was taken on trying to stop weapons sales to Israel that failed miserably, at the United Nations, the UN did its fourth veto on a ceasefire in Gaza. So the U.S. is just, our government is horrible. The Biden administration is horrible. And this is one of the reasons why Vice President Harris lost the election. Not the only one, for sure. But it weighed heavy on many people's minds during this vote. And now we are faced with President Trump, who, well, to his credit, well, maybe not to his credit at all. You know, he's always talked about NATO, and to the extent that he says the U.S. ought to get out of NATO and let everybody else be on their own. On one level, you know, the U.S. complicity in funding all these wars that NATO gets into, it has a bit of a ring to it, even to me. But let's go to see what NATO itself, how its structure includes Israel, even though Israel is not a member of NATO, but it is considered what's called, in quotes, a vital security partner of NATO. And particularly, as you see on the NATO website, particularly in the fields of counterterrorism, and you could put in parentheses, as practice on Palestinians, intelligence sharing, which of course the U.S. Shares with Israel and with other people and about Palestinians, maritime cooperation in the Mediterranean, which means going after all the Palestinian fisher people and anything that has to do with Gaza, military technology tested, and just might as well put on a Palestinian, because Gaza has been the testing field for Israeli weapons, which means U.S. weapons, which means also weapons that other NATO countries have. And then the latest thing is this artificial intelligence, which is on steroids in Israel. And it's used to pick out assassination victims. We've seen, you know, what it's done in the last 3 months of the assassinations of senior leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah, and even going as far as going into Iran to do these assassinations. For the United States, I mean, we still, we have the $20 billion in weapons that has now essentially passed the U.S. Senate. We have, it's over 100 million pounds of military equipment the U.S. has sent into Israel since October 7th. It's a horrific amount of carnage that the United States has done. And it follows, I mean, it's on steroids too, but the United States over the years has exported weapons. Israel and Saudi Arabia have been the two top countries that the United States has exported. And to say that also it makes you want to cry. The major export of the United States of America is weapons. I mean, and that is just a horrific legacy that the United States has. And I would say that, while there are a lot of other NATO countries that have contributed to Israel, and Severin mentioned, Germany certainly has, the UK has, but I will say that now it seems like at least the limitations that each of these governments, whether it's the UK, whether it's Germany, barely saying, yes, we will look at international law, but places like Spain, Norway, Ireland saying, we're not exporting anything because we know there are the violations of international humanitarian law, and the law of warfare is being done by Israel. So we're not exporting. So, you know, between Canada, the UK, Belgium, Italy, Spain, Norway, NATO members are beginning to do what they should be doing, which is stopping these arms transfers because of the Israeli violations of international law. We can go through the whole litany of how many weapons have been sent in before these nations finally started saying, uh-oh. And it wasn't that they did it on their own. I mean, it was citizen activism that ensuing their national governments saying, you are violating international law. And we've tried to bring that same thing onto the United States. We haven't gotten very far because the Biden administration flatly will not acknowledge that, well, first, that there's a genocide going on, and secondly, that U.S. weapons are being used in violations of international law, to include not providing any, the assistance that you need to keep starving people alive in the occupied territories, now destroyed territories of Gaza, and what is looking more and more like a genocide going on in the West Bank, and also the blatant attacks on Lebanon. One interesting feature of this whole thing is Turkey. Turkey has blocked cooperation between NATO and Israel because of the war in Gaza. It has vetoed all NATO engagement with Israel since October, but of course it's still going on. You see the U.S. having deployed military folks into Israel, and of course the huge weapons transfers. It's not like Turkey has clean hands on this thing. There's certainly plenty of oil that's being brought through pipelines from Azerbaijan through Turkey and on into Israel. It's not clean on this either, but it seems to have the greatest reputation of at least calling for no cooperation between Israel and NATO. Turkey does allow the United States to use one of its air bases, the one at Incirlik, for the United States to move weapons from the U.S. through that air base and then on to Israel. So as a final point, the U.S. is neck deep in the Israeli genocide of Gaza, and to the extent that the U.S. represents, the legacy of NATO, NATO too is neck deep in the Israeli genocide of Gaza. And as an American, I want to apologize to the rest of the world for our inability to get our government to stop this participation in genocide. It is a horrible legacy that will weigh on our shoulders for the rest of our lives. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Anne, and I know we all send solidarity to you and to all those of you in the peace movement in the US who work so hard against such great odds. So now we're turning to our final speaker. It's a pleasure to welcome Ludo de Bravender from Vrede in Belgium, and he's going to talk about preparing for the next NATO summit. Welcome, Ludo.
Thank you, Kate, and I also want to thank Sevin, Kirsten, Michael, and Anne for helping us to reveal this true face of NATO, to help us understand that NATO is a war machine and that primarily serves the interests of the military-industrial complex, and also that the population is deceived and manipulated, that in the name of security, NATO governments are endangering the welfare of our nation or our nations by increasing military spending to unprecedented and dangerous levels. And this is at the expense of, as we all know, public services, social and environmental spending. And these are the areas that really provide security. So the policy of confrontation with Russia is reaching worrying proportions. We also heard again that the genocide in Gaza shows that NATO countries are not at all concerned with international law, human rights, international stability and security, and that they have double standards. And so all that matters to this war alliance are geostrategic interests of the US, and let's say it or name it as it is, and its satellite states in Europe. So NATO, to conclude this, and what we understood from the several interventions, is an increasing obstacle to achieving world peace. So I want to remind that in all of us in 2008, the international peace movement launched the Stuttgart Appeal, and this was to organize us in opposing NATO. And according to the appeal, we have to reject, and it's on the website of No to War, No to NATO, we have to reject military responses to global and regional crises to achieve the vision of a peaceful world. And so I quote, "We refuse to live under the terror of nuclear weapons and reject a new arms race. We must decrease military expenditure, directing resources instead to meeting human needs. We must democratize and demilitarize the relations between peoples and establish new forms of peaceful cooperation to build a more secure and just world." So reads the appeal. So I think this is from 2008, and 16 years later is still the case. The demands and what we want hasn't changed. So since 2009, the peace movement has held counter summits during every NATO summit, with conferences, webinars, demonstrations, and direct actions to raise public awareness and mobilize people. This was the case in all those summits. Just the first one was a big one, Strasbourg, then Lisbon, Chicago, Wales, Warsaw, several times in Brussels, London, Madrid, Vilnius, and Washington. And so at all these summits, we were present in one or another way, and also with local actions. And now Dutch peace organizations and activists, we are in touch with them, and some of them are here, I saw, in cooperation with the international peace movement, have started initial preparations for a counter summit in Den Haag, because that's the place where the next summit, NATO summit, will be held from the 24th to the 6th of June. And so these preparations, the first signs are promising. And I think it is especially important in these times to motivate not only peace activists from the Netherlands and peace activists from other countries, but also women and youth movements, trade unions, environmental and human rights activists to take part in our protests, because the war policies of NATO have consequences for all the fields we are working in as movements. It's too early to get you the details of what the plans are for Den Haag. In our understanding and what we heard, there will be a big meeting, a physical meeting, or it is planned in February in the Netherlands, where it will be a weekend where one day the peace movement, the Dutch peace movement, will come together, and another day, a second day, will be aimed to have also the international peace activists and others around the table to discuss what can be done and how to organize. And so hopefully we will soon be able to announce the dates of and initiatives for the coming next counter summit, hopefully somewhere in the Netherlands. And I know, and we understood there are many difficulties or obstacles practically, because there are big events taking place in Amsterdam and also in Den Haag in the same period. But also, of course, there's the right-wing government and probably the intentions to, for example, close partly the borders for peace activists to attend demonstrations and actions. So, but nevertheless, we call up for as wide a mobilization as possible. I think from Belgium, we want to try to go to the Netherlands with a significant delegation. And I think it will be the case also in other countries where large groups from those countries will also try to participate. And apart from that, I hope there will be also, because it's as important, many local actions elsewhere in the world and awareness raising activities for those who cannot come to the Netherlands. So my conclusion is, or my call is, let us unite to fight for peace and justice, and let us raise our voices. No to NATO, yes to peace. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ludo, and thanks to all our speakers. That was fantastic, incredibly useful and interesting, and I'm so pleased that this is being recorded and will be available on our website in the near future. So now we have some time for questions. I can see a couple there in the chat, which I'm about to ask, and then I can see Agneta Norberg, you're raising your hand. If possible, Agneta, can you put your question in the chat? But if not, we can call you in a bit, but it's easier from the tech point of view if people can put their questions in the chat. So first of all, thanks to Ibala Buranat for this question. Can NATO and BRICS coexist as rival blocs? Or is there a potential for new multilateral frameworks that bridges the gap between Western-led and emerging economies? That's a crucial question. So who from our panel would like to respond on that to start with?
Maybe I say something to this?
Yeah, please, Michael, go ahead.
No, I mean, they're completely different organizations. One is a military organization and BRICS is a completely civilian organization. I can't see that there's any cooperation among them. And BRICS has no plans of creating any military alliance. And I think that's so attractive for peace people like us, that there's a huge new world body merging with big countries like China, India, but also South Africa, Brazil, and then many others, who say, no, we will only cooperate militarily, and we accept the UN Charter, we accept the equal sovereignty and the non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. And therefore, we don't need any military. And I think for us, it's a great hope, because if we want to have in future a peace without weapons, without arms, I mean, a global order without arms, we have to go back to the UN Charter. And now the only body, what means the only body, it's a very large body, who supports this idea is no longer the West, where the UN Charter originated from, but it is now the BRICS countries. So I don't think there's any cooperation with NATO. I think the Ukraine war will weaken NATO enormously. It's much more than what happened in Afghanistan. And I think that will create maybe a new opening to have a world without these military alliances, or at least weakened military alliances, and therefore being more peaceful.
Thanks, Michael. Anyone else like to explore any aspects of this? Anne, over to you.
Yeah, well, I'll just mention that, of course, BRICS is on the target list of the West, whether it's the U.S., and surely the European Union has it on its target list. So good luck to it. And it certainly seems to be what a lot of countries want to do, is to cooperate with another group of people that haven't been trying to run the world for the last decades. Thank you.
Can I just say something to this? And you know, the world has changed. It's not the same anymore. When the United States thought they should be the world leader, it was in '92 when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Warsaw Pact, and they were indeed the only military power, the only economic power, the only power which really had technology. That's all gone. It's all gone. It's now already the original BRICS countries are larger than the G7. I mean, 10 years ago, we couldn't imagine that anybody is bigger than G7. It has changed. And since these countries keep their nerves and even have a meeting in Russia, which we say is an aggressive country, I mean, don't we see the signs of the time? Here in European Union, in the Parliament, we have one resolution after the other for total war. And we don't even mention BRICS. Just next door is BRICS. I mean, that's most of our countries we export with. We see now China as an enemy and all the rest of it. We don't realize Europe is now 5.5% of world population, and we control 14% of world production, or GDP. I mean, already the original, without the new members, were already 45% of the world population. 45 compared to 5.5. And the economy of there was 37%. It's all increased now because there's about 30 countries about to join and associate with it, which is fine as an organization to association because it's not the military, so you don't have to have these firm structures. It is our thing that we ignore, and we ignore reality. It has changed. Wolfowitz is not possible today anymore. You know, the Dick Cheney, what was called the New American Century, has only lasted 20 years. I mean, luckily, and it's now on the decline. The only thing which I hope when we look at all these rockets in Ukraine is, you know, that we somehow accept our role in the world, which is not anymore what we thought it is, and not blow the whole place up simply because we can't accept that that the world is round, that we have 90% of the people not on our side, and that we have to cooperate with everybody. That's a new world, and that's what we really have to strive for. So we will make here a big event on BRICS here. We bring Brazil here and things like this one. It's very, very important that this European Parliament realizes that they are not alone in this world anymore.
Thanks. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Sorry.
Anyone else want to come in on that, or no? Okay, so we'll go to the next one, which is also an important question. So this is from Carol Stavris. Thank you, Carol. NATO's military emissions are increasing. It spent $1.34 trillion on the military in 2023, putting an estimated additional 31 million metric tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, equivalent to the annual CO2 emissions of around 6.7 million average US cars. How can NATO's climate damage be publicised urgently? And I would actually add to that, how can it be stopped or rolled back as a minimum? So how can we really get to grips with that and change that situation? So who would like to come in on that? Ludo? And
Yeah, just a few additions. I don't know how it can be publicized urgently. It is already done. I mean, and it's just we need more people that publicize it around, because we have a lot of data already connected to militarism and carbon emissions. Just something else. For example, if NATO countries spend 2% of their GDP to carbon emissions, which is almost the case, then the carbon emissions of those countries in military carbon emissions will be bigger than those of Germany and Japan together. So that's very important, and this should convince climate activists that our cause is also their cause, that we have a common struggle, that the climate change is something they have, that militarism is something climate activists should be involved in. And on the other way around, that climate change is also important for the peace movement, since it has a clear link with security. I see, you see already now that many countries, because look to Syria, you know, there is a link with climate change in Afghanistan. If you look at the Sahel, Boko Haram, organizations like that, there you see that drought, the shrinking Chad Lake, for example, and so that causes a lot of social economic burdens to the local population. That's a trigger for violent conflict. So also for us, it's important to fight climate change. So this is something, it's mutual, and I think this is. You can see it on many domains, that we as a movement, social movements, whether we are peace activists or trade unions or whatever, that's what I tried to tell before, that it's important to fight together all those challenges and all those endangering organizations like NATO. So, well, and this, you know, if we want to create awareness among people, the only way to do it is publicize each other's concerns and making the links clear.
thanks very much, Ludo. Kirsten, over to you. Unmute.
I have a double mute, so I half unmuted. I think the first thing to say is the figures around the climate emissions of the military are not are not very good. The data's not very good. And amidst large chunks of some of the stuff that the military does, we tend to be pretty good at working out the military to the extent that there have been people saying, for example, the fuel use in Ukraine just to fight the war is on a par with the emissions of Belgium or the Netherlands. It's that level of use. But really, military activity tends to break down into three categories. You've got use of fuel by military forces. You've got the supply chain and use around of military equipment. Things like when you fire a missile, what was the energy that went into and the carbon that went into making that missile. And finally, there's the analysis of how much carbon you need to spend to rebuild if you're in a conflict. And really, a lot of the figures we see floating around really only cover the first of those things, the fueling of the military. So I think part of the story, I think, has to be getting better data, however we do it, and to move it through. And it's a big number. Our friends at the Conflict Environment Observatory put out a great joint report with Scientists for Global Responsibility, and they were saying that based on their analysis and best figures they could get hold of, is that military activity is responsible for something like 5 to 6% of global emissions. We are not going to get on top of any kind of climate target without getting on top of military activity. But I think what they also say is, there's no such thing as a green bomb. There's really no such thing as a green helicopter. The only way we can really start to scale back military emissions is by scaling back military activity. And if you want a greener world, you have to just have less military activity, because in the end, that's the only thing that's going to work. Anyway, some quick thoughts there.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Right, going to our next question now. This is from Hanya Maravich. Thank you, Hanya. The USA is driving global tensions, protecting Netanyahu and his crimes, defying ICC decisions on one hand, and continued warmongering rhetoric in the case of Russia-Ukraine's fight on the other. Do you see any European country prepared to confront the US and choose different alliances?
Well, I haven't seen any. We certainly would hope that there'd be a spine, a backbone, a little bit of courage of some of the countries to say, wait a minute, this is wrong. We're not standing with you on this at all. But it's not working that way. It doesn't seem like. I mean, there are, as I mentioned before, there are some countries that are not sending weapons to Israel, but none of them have told the United States, you got to stop this. I mean, they do it actually in the United Nations and in the General Assembly on the votes for Palestine. Essentially, that's a middle finger to the U.S. And when the votes in the UN Security Council for ceasefire are like 14-1, the overwhelming numbers always saying to the United States, you're wrong. But it needs to be in more venues than just those two. Thank you.
Thanks. And Michael, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. When we have this, what I thought we had maybe distinguished stronger, what is actually NATO and what are NATO states. I mean, when we speak about the United States, what they do in Gaza and all the rest of it, so the United States will be always there, whether we have NATO or not. So I think that the distinction might be useful, because NATO as an organization is now, to a certain degree, under threat, because it will not only have lost the war there, but it will also, the expansion of NATO will not take place as planned. I think the usefulness of NATO will come down. And even if you don't like Trump, nor do I, of course, good gracious, but I think he might be quite good for Europe, because we finally have to think, what do we want actually? What is our interest? Because he doesn't like us. And I think that's a very good point he has for us in the European Parliament. Now we're losing our heads. We think we have now to double up like the United States, being neocons and getting armed and things like this one. And maybe for you it might be interesting, because we try to, the European Parliament is full of war. I mean, here it's a majority, even the left votes for a war resolution. I mean, I've never seen this in my life. But we try now to prepare a document for January, which we call Europe a peace power, a power for peace. And it is meant to be a white paper that opposes the white paper we expect from the European Union, which is for its common defense policies, which means that the European Union should have more army, create its own arms, and blah 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 blah, and spend a lot of money on these type of things. So we try already for Europe, at least. I mean, there's a very small organization here, and to have an alternative for this one. And I think therefore it's also important to distinguish if we talk about NATO, or do we talk about the EU, or do we talk about the US? Of course, these are all linked, but I think it's intellectually important to separate these things if we want to really come to the point what happens to NATO in the future.
Okay, anyone else want to come in on that one? Yeah, Ludo?
Yeah, just with regard to what Michael said, I think, it can work in both ways, if US position in NATO and consequences for Europe under Trump. I think, you see now there's a lot of discussion going on in Europe about what with Trump and NATO. And of course, then again, we have these talks, as we had a few years ago, about strategic autonomy in Europe. And this can work in a very awful way, in the sense that now we see more and more. We need more and more military spending to defend ourselves against the threat of Russia, and the psychology of fear is used in that sense. And so you see already that we have to spend even more than the target originally put, the NATO target of 2% of GDP.
Yeah.
Some are saying we need at least 2.5%, even 3%, as Rutte said, 3% and more. So this is a very crazy situation, although we spend already 4 times more than Russia is doing. So
much more than this, yeah.
Yeah, and at the same time, when we increase military spending, we meet also the complaints of Trump, because he's complaining about the burden sharing. And so this can eventually even close the gap with the United States, in that sense. So it's a very dangerous situation. This is also an effect of the election of Trump as a president, that Europe will be more militarized, probably.
But there's
that's what they try.
Ludo, what I'm just trying to say, there is an alternative to this one.
Yes, of course, yeah.
If you look at I just published an article about this, the resolution passed in the European Parliament. It's a call for total war at the time the war is already lost, which is very typical. Many countries do that. The most famous one was, unfortunately, in the Second World War, was Germany. But the call for total war at a time a war is de facto lost, and that happens now. And if I say, but listen, what interest do you have in the war with Russia? What interest do you have in sanctions? What interest do you have that Ukraine is destroyed? What interest do you have that Ukraine is in NATO or not? What interest do you have to cut you off from your natural resources in Asia? What interest do you have now to cut you off the trade routes to Asia, where all the economic growth is? Europe acts against its own interest for the time being. But I'm convinced that we have to work now on Europeans, on politicians. We have very weak politicians in Europe presently, very weak politicians. Probably the time we have the weakest politicians in my memory. I mean, Scholz, Macron, what is this, Sturmer is this British guy? And, in Netherlands, where my wife comes from, I don't even know the name of this guy. Very weak. And I think it's a time for us to speak up. And also, what I want to say before, that we have to have a strategy. The strategy has to be that Europe's own way must be a way to be a peace power in the world. It is the only way in which we can survive as an exporting country, and maintain our economy and things like this. Well, it's not because we want to be nice. It's because it's the only option we have. Europe is a great power, what Mrs. von der Leyen wants, is not going to happen. It's just not going to happen.
We've got a few more
totally agree.
You're much too diverse.
We've got 2 more questions, you chaps. I want to ask more questions from the audience here. Okay, so we've got a couple on a similar theme. So first of all, from Hanya, what potential is there to revive the non-aligned movement in today's geopolitical landscape? And then Ulla Klotzer from Finland, also later on down the chat stream, she's also asking a similar question, saying that countries that have been historically non-aligned, like Sweden and Finland and so on, being drawn into NATO. So do we have any comments from our panel about non-alignment?
Well, I'll mention, as Ludo said, the psychology of fear, and certainly the U.S. pushing on Ukraine to go into NATO, the Russian response to it, and then so many of the countries saying, "Uh-oh, now we're going to be next for Russia." And so you have these countries that have been non-aligned in Europe, and then all of a sudden, okay, psychology of fear hits in, and there they go, join up with NATO. So it's a sad state of the world that that's happening, but we see what happens when wars, when other countries instigate wars in countries not their own, I guess. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Can I add something?
Yes, please, Kirsten.
Yeah, I was just going to remark that, when I think of the non-aligned movement, I think as India as being the kind of hub of the non-aligned movement as it used to be. And yet, it really is a focus for arms sales from especially France. It's one of France's biggest arms export partners. I'm going to say as well, Israel are a big exporter of weapons to India. So I think, again, it's been sort of drawn into kind of the NATO remit just by using kind of common systems and common weapons and becoming very reliant on the NATO military machine. So could you then see them kind of stepping away and creating a new non-aligned movement? I'm not sure. Not sure.
Maybe I could just throw something in here, because I am aware that there are kind of discussions and some conferences taking place in the global south about a new non-alignment, a new non-aligned movement. And when I think about it, I in particular think of the anti-nuclear focus of the global south, and people often either don't know or forget that pretty much the entire global south is already self-organized as nuclear weapons-free zones. And it was states of the global south that led to the achievement of the Treaty on the Prohibitions of Nuclear Weapons in the UN. And these are things that we don't get to hear about, so we have a focus on the global north. It's not surprising in a way, because that's, where these big forces come from, and that, that's the West and so on, political global north as well. But there are major things happening in the global south, and BRICS is a part of that, and the kind of multipolar world, which is sort of emerging, whether or not the big powers want it to. The multipolar world is emerging. So I do take heart from that, I must say. So I don't feel we have to discuss the next question. How close are we to a nuclear war? It's been on a lot of lips over the past couple of days here, that's for sure. Anyone like to comment on that?
Maybe a short answer. I mean,
Go on then.
as you know, there is every year the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that tries to estimate the danger of a nuclear war. And unfortunately, this doomsday clock that they publish every January is moving always closer to midnight. The last clock was only 90 seconds. In 72, I think it was 12 minutes. So it means that we are now closer to, in a dangerous situation concerning nuclear weapons than we had in the Cold War. The old Cold War, let's say. And so we see that more and more nuclear arms come in the forefront of the military strategic strategies, and also in the narratives and the discourses of political leaders. We know that Putin used several times the threat of nuclear war, and we know also that, or let's say, if Biden says you can use the missiles to reach Russia, that this will the kind of reaction Russia will give. So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of confrontation that they are aiming for. Very, very dangerous policy. And this is connected to the global south. Also, this is a different stance. I think it was somewhere in the chat also that if you look to the non-nuclear movement, if you look to the world map of countries that signed the Prohibition Treaty, they are mainly from the global south. Again, 94 countries signed it and more than 70 ratified it. Look to for example, the nuclear weapon-free zones. It's Africa, it's Southeast Asia, it's part of Oceania, it's Latin America. So you see again this difference. And let's say the rest of the world, it's always the same picture. The rest of the world doesn't follow us anymore, doesn't, they want to have a separate kind of, they don't see, they don't want these policies anymore. So they reject it. And this is maybe the hopeful sign for the future that we have this big part of the world that is opposing this kind of policies.
Thanks, Ludo. We've got a question from Mary Sifferland. She said, any data on Russian, North Korean, Iranian military CO2 emissions? Don't know if anyone knows offhand or anyone got any ideas of where Mary can look up that data.
As far as I know, that data is not available. Though people have made estimates, and I think again I'd refer people to the Scientists for Global Responsibility. They do the sums, but I think that's as close as we can get, really.
Okay, so there are estimates, but we don't know anything for certain. Okay, I'm just trying to scroll through now, see if there's any final questions. There's a lot of opinion sharing here, so please do scroll through, but I can't see any more direct questions. So do any of the panel want to say any final words? Or
yeah, I would like to say something.
Yeah, Michael, over to you.
I spent 34 years with the UN and mostly in war countries, almost entirely. And I think what is very important that and that's very bad also in peace movements in Western countries, to remember that we have a UN Charter. I think still the UN Charter is the most wonderful document we have made. The UN Charter basically means no war, no war anymore, not preventive war, not any war that we have to negotiate. And it means, of course, also humanity, because it has human rights in it and all the rest of it. We won't have any other document like this one. And I think there's a hope, because it has been accepted now by the BRICS countries as a guidance for the future, because the UN Charter recognizes every state equal and not one being the guardian of all the rest of it. It is very, very important. If we want a world after the Ukraine war, because it will be the new question after the Ukraine war, what does the world order look like? It will not go back to a United States world order. Then it has to be one that is based on the UN Charter. And the UN Charter, what all forget, was very, very successful, because it was only about wars among states, and they almost didn't take place anymore since the Second World War. There were very few of them. Unfortunately, Ukraine is one of the biggest of them.
Okay, any other panelists want to say anything now?
I was going to just mention that one of the things that NATO is really important for is in terms of how it behaves and how its impact on the world is its continuing and should we say cunning propaganda. It continues to kind of cast military spending as defense spending. I was looking up the thing about the 2% of GDP, and I hadn't realized it's actually called the Defense Investment Pledge. An investment pledge. I mean, what could be wrong with that? It feels like you're going to the bank with your little savings and putting it in. You're making a pledge. And I think we actually need to talk about need to find good language to actually start to cut through some of this propaganda and say, look, what that really is that's investment in that. If that's not investment, that's pouring money into a war machine that's already churning through tens of billions of dollars a year, and that's what we should be saying. So yeah, no, I think it's it was one thing I wanted to say in my talk was just let's understand that NATO isn't just a military alliance; it's a propaganda machine, and we need to be talking about it as such.
Absolutely. And Kirsten, I'm sure you're aware that in Britain, our government now calls the whole kind of defence military nuclear thing. They now call it the nuclear enterprise, you know, I mean, just sickening, really. Anne, over to you.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with Michael that the UN Charter is an excellent, excellent document and should be the guide for us. But I will say the United States of America has had a few wars since World War II that we have to remember. I mean, the Vietnam War, we look at the Afghanistan War, the Iraq War, we look at the war in Central America that the U.S. has been a part of. So again, apologies from me as an American, because my country is just not going along with the charter, and it's not going along with peace. And we certainly hope that Trump, for all of his
and it's a very long
strange-
discussion, because the charter only deals with wars which is between armies of nation states. And most of the things you mentioned are actually interventions in internal conflicts, which are not regulated by the UN Charter. So if we have to do something for the future, we should not throw the Charter away. We just have to add something that now most of the conflicts are not among states, but within states. And that has to be regulated too. And it has not been done until now.
Okay,
Well, thank you. I didn't know that, but I'll still say that the U.S. is a culprit. Thank you.
I'm
I
not
would agree on
sure
this
there
one.
will be that many people disagreeing with you there, Anne. So thank you very much.
And you should write me one, Sam. I would like to talk to you more.
Okay, you too. And then now I'm going to turn to Rainer Brown to make some closing remarks. Over to you, Rainer.
Thank you, Kate. First of all, thank all the speakers for their brilliant interventions and the discussion. You know, I would like to add 3 points. First of all, I think Michael is totally correct when you say that we will have in the year 2025 the discussion about new security order in the world, about the UN Charter. And I think also we have to deepen the discussion about a new security system for Europe, having in mind that we have the 50th anniversary of the OSCE, of the Helsinki process in August this year. I think this is a huge challenge for all of us in the peace movement to develop these alternatives. And in addition to the UN Charter, I'm always mentioning that we have to come back to the ideas, the philosophy of common security as a basic for a new security order, not only in Europe, but in all parts of the world. And I would underline the new report of IPB and others for a common security strategy and order in the Indo-Pacific region. Please have a look at it. It's on the IPB website. And I think it underlines the possibility with the philosophy of common security to develop new common security strategies. I would add second point. I think we should stronger than maybe in this discussion, having in mind the military spending. NATO is spending, or the world is spending $2.4 trillion US. NATO is spending more than 1.3 trillion every year for military spending. And when I'm looking to the climate summit in Baku, and when I'm looking to the diversity summit before Baku,
Biodiversity, yeah.
But the world cannot live with this amount of money spent for military purposes.
No.
We need the money to overcome poverty, hunger, and the ecological crisis and the climate problems. So disarmament is a key challenge, I think, for the future. And my last point is we should never forget that we have 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world and that we are modernizing all the nuclear weapons. And 5 NATO countries are doing this at the top. The US is spending, I think, 2 trillion the next 10 years for modernizing this. So when we are criticizing NATO, we should never forget the nuclear weapons and put it again and again in the middle point of our discussions. And with these informations on this website, and for our network, NATO War, NATO NATO, this network was the opening of the series of webinars we want to do in the next months, preparing our actions and activities Ludo mentioned in Den Haag and Amsterdam. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Rainer. Thanks to all our fantastic speakers. Thank you to you, the audience. If you're not already signed up to the No to War, No to NATO network, please do go to our website, add your name, and be in receipt of our regular bulletins full of information and also information about our next webinars, as Rainer has outlined. And of course, we hope to see you all in the Netherlands in June. So thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Mm.
Yeah. Ludo, great to see you.
Yeah, I had to skip. We just launched a festival, Eye on Palestine. It's called, with more than 30 events from now
Sorry,
until
hold up for 1
I give
second. We're